And when people try to cover politics as a boxing match and as a horse race, it leads us to do and say and feel stupid things about tribe. I want Republicans and Democrats to differ about some policy issues and then set it aside and go have a beer together and break bread together. And, maybe some people are Packers fans and some people are Chiefs fans, but you wouldn't need to sort your community based on your political tribal loyalties. And right now we have too many folks who think if you're going to do politics, you got to do it as blood sport. And if you don't want to do it as blood sport, then you shouldn't be involved at all. What we need is a lot more regular people to show up and roll their eyes at the weirdos in politics.
We're pleased to welcome Senator Sasse as part of our Constitution Day Live program today. The senator is not just the senator from Nebraska, but also a longtime student and teacher of the Constitution, and we're delighted to explore with him his observations and thoughts on the relationship between the branches of government as it's set up in the Constitution. Senator, could we just start with your description of what is the unique job of your branch?
Well, thank you for having me. Good to be with you and your students. Well, obviously, we are the legislative body, the Article 1 body. So what we're supposed to do is write the laws. Article 1 and Article 3 have different purposes, but Articles 1 and 2, so Article 1, the legislature, and Article 2, the executive branch, are supposed to be able to be hired and fired by the American people on a regular basis. So in a democratic republic, we're supposed to be the legislative body that between the Senate and the House together construct whatever the legal framework is for the United States. And the Senate is supposed to be the most deliberative body. The House is obviously the popular body, hired or fired by the people every 24 months. Senators are supposed to serve 6 years, which means every time there's an election, only 1/3 of senators are turning over. So we're a continuing body in that every November when there's an election, and January when new people are, November of an odd number, even numbered year, and January of an odd numbered year when folks are sworn in, 2/3 of us still show back up that next January and continue the conversation. So we're supposed to be doing the legislating. We're supposed to do oversight of the executive branch to make sure that it is carrying out the laws that have been passed by the Congress. And then we're supposed to also ratify treaties and confirm folks who work for the president in Article 2.
That's a lot. What does that look like in just a regular day's calendar for you and your staff? How does that go?
Well, so first of all, we spend, 80% of our work weeks in Washington, D.C. and 20% of the work weeks back home. I live in Nebraska, so I commute almost every week. So I'm home on weekends for Husker football and youth sports and driving Uber and driving a garbage truck and detasseling corn and doing ag manufacturing and listening to my constituents. But in the 80% of the weekdays that we're in D.C., when the Senate meets, the traditional structure is committees meet in the morning and the full body of the Senate meets in the afternoon. So I sit on the Intelligence, Judiciary, Finance, and Budget committees. And those committees, unfortunately, are less and less deliberative over time because I think we've made a bad mistake of putting cameras in every room around here. So what the public tends to see is a whole bunch of senators at these televised hearings acting like political weirdos and trying to grandstand for a great 10-second soundbite that they hope will go viral. And so that's really not what the committee structure is supposed to be doing. The committees are supposed to be a place where you can develop some expertise. I happen to sit on 4 pretty good committees. The average senator sits on 3 committees, and that allows you with 15 to 20 of your colleagues to develop a little bit of expertise. I'm coming to you right now having just been at a meeting with the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. That's because sitting on the Judiciary Committee, I have some oversight responsibilities for the Department of Justice, and one of the sub-agencies under Justice is how do we run all the federal prisons? And one of the most important questions that the Bureau of Prisons has is how do we make sure when people are in a federal institution, prisoners tend to be there for on average 10 or 11 years, that they can redeem some of that time, and when they get released that they don't immediately recidivate and reoffend and get reconvicted, reincarcerated. And so the question is, do our work programs inside these federal institutions work? One of my jobs is to think about what the legislative framework is for that, but do that by oversight with the people who are the senior managers of the correctional institutions. That doesn't tend to lend itself very well to sound bites. And so the committees are supposed to be deliberative. My intelligence committee work tends to work pretty well, but that's because we're overseeing the NSA and the CIA, and all the work that we do is classified. And so we do it in a bunker, we do it in a skiff, a compartmentalized facility where cameras would be illegal. You can't even have your cell phone or a smartwatch in there. And that committee tends to work pretty well because there aren't cameras. But by and large, right now, the Congress isn't too productive because you've got a lot of people who'd rather be social media stars than servant leaders trying to do the long-term grinding work of getting smart about topics that the American people sent you to do here on a 6 or 12-year basis on their behalf.
You've just alluded to a couple of these things, changes that have occurred in the cases you've mentioned very recently because of introduction of technology into the Senate. What other ways has the role and responsibility and kind of practical work of the Senate evolved since the founding and its original conception?
Yeah, I think there have been two major changes over the course of the last century. One of them I've alluded to, which is more immediacy in the media. So a shift from print journalism to radio and to the rise of TV and now viral videos on the internet makes this sense of, in a nation of 330 million people, the immediacy of if somebody sees an image of a put down or a quip real quickly, they think that government should move very, very fast. And government that moves fast tends to either screw a lot of things up or not actually get anything done because it ends up in tribal gridlock. It would be more healthy for the American people to consume more of what used to be print journalism and less of image-centric stuff. And then for the Congress to move more slowly, but move on a smaller set of more important issues. So that the first thing is our media diet is not very healthy, and that changed a lot over the course of the last century. The second biggest thing that's happened is after the New Deal, after the Great Depression, we ended up with a much, much larger federal government. And what that did was it gave a lot of executive power to the president, and Congress has gotten weaker over the last century because the presidency has gotten so strong, and politicians have an incentive to pass the buck to the executive branch, which has an army of bureaucrats writing regulations, and both parties really love to do this. So I think the thing that from a constitutional standpoint has devolved over the course of the last 240 years, for your students thinking here, not chiefly about my media consumption questions, but a little bit more about the relationship among the three branches, is the single biggest change is that Article 1, which is supposed to really write the laws, and you can't write a law to speak to every circumstance. So you have to think, what are the big and important things that should exist at the federal government? And how do you allow the rest of governance to happen at the state and local level? What's happened is the Congress has started to pass much more generic laws that aren't really completed. And then they punt to the executive branch to write regulations that essentially finish the statute. I think the single biggest change is we're supposed to have a system where we distinguish between legislation, which is deliberative, and administration or the executive branch, which is supposed to carry out the laws. And increasingly in our tradition now, we give the president a lot more power to write a huge bit of what counts as our legal framework for the country. And I think that results in a lot less healthy laws, a lot less thought out legislation, and frankly, way too much tribalism and doomsday panic around every presidential election. You have people constantly saying, this is the last election in American history, or this is the be all and end all, and the whole country's going off a cliff if the bad guy of the other party wins a presidential election. Our founders would be totally confused by that kind of speech because they didn't think that the president's job was kingly. Even the term, I said I'd pull up, but I'll say one more thing here. Even the term president is a pretty weird term. I mean, the term existed before the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention in 1787, but it was basically not used anywhere. The word president, as our founders employed it, was just a way to create a noun around the term presiding officer. They wanted somebody that had a ministerial servant-like role in the executive branch to carry out the laws. And they worked really hard not to give kingly powers to a president. And so they made up this term president, which was supposed to mean like secretary of the federal government, the presiding officer, the person who makes sure that the laws that the Congress passed get carried out. And right now we treat our presidents a lot more like they're, priests or kings. They're these giant figures. And our founders, and George Washington in particular, would have been very confused by that because he wanted to make sure there wasn't any regal sense that a president is all that important.
You've spent some nice time here kind of describing the relationship between the executive and legislative branches of the government. In the Senate and in committees that you serve on, you also have a very specific relationship to the judiciary. Can you describe how that relationship works and what may be the strengths and weaknesses of it as it's currently functioning?
Yeah. So obviously our judiciary is incredibly important. We talk about the separate but equal branches that are supposed to check and balance one another, but kind of like the executive branch, Article 2 has gotten stronger as Article 1, the Congress, has gotten weaker. The judiciary has also gotten more powerful over the course of the last 50, 60, 70 years. And our founders, I think, would be confused by that as well. And in particular, they would be confused by how much protest you see outside the Supreme Court. And that flows from a tradition of, you could name lots of starting points, but between the 1930s and 1970s, I think everybody would agree, the judiciary started to assert a lot more powers that are quasi-legislative powers. And that's really not what the judge's job is. And I think one of the best ways to think about that as, if you were explaining it to an 8th grader or a 10th grader or a 12th grader, is our judiciary historically has worn robes precisely as symbolism of the fact that they were cloaking their personal preferences. We don't have Republican judges or Democratic judges. Our judges don't stand for re-election, and they're not supposed to signal what their policy preferences are. Some judge might have strong personal views about, minimum wage should be much higher than it is. Minimum wage should be a little higher than it is. Minimum wage leads to the destruction and erosion of jobs and accelerates automation. You could have a lot of different policy views as an individual, but when they're a judge, none of that is supposed to matter, because what they're supposed to do is make sure that individual laws don't violate the constitutional protections that are allowed to the American people or recognized for the American people as existing in nature. We believe we have a lot of pre-governmental rights. When we say people have the right to freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, protest, we don't think the government gives us these rights. These are rights people have because they're created in the image of God. And in nature, these rights exist for people. And the government and the constitutional framework is our shared project to secure those rights. Judges are supposed to protect the individual rights of people, not being usurped by laws that are overreaching. And they're supposed to make sure that, in particular, from the district court level to the circuit or the appeals court level, that everybody gets a hearing and then gets a right of appeal about whether or not the facts have rightly been determined in a case, and that the law is being rightly applied to the circumstances and facts at play in an individual issue or matter. And so when there is so much protest around the judiciary, it's probably a sign that the judiciary is acting a lot more like a legislature. And one of the reasons why that's dangerous is because we don't give our judges those kinds of powers. And in return, they get lifetime tenure because they're not supposed to have to be accountable to the people because they weren't doing anything like representing the public will. And so if judges are going to act like legislators, then it would be pretty important in a democratic system for them to be fireable by the people if the people have different views than the way the judges are choosing to legislate. So I think it's fair to say Article 2, the executive branch, has grown in power a lot. Article 3, the judiciary, has grown in power quite a bit. And both of these flow from a dysfunction in the Congress of people wanting to be lifetime politicians and therefore not wanting to make a lot of the hard choices that might get them fired. And so you have a lot of people that are in my institution who don't want to do hard things. They don't want to be fireable. They don't want to ever really leave Washington, D.C. And so they punt powers to both the executive and judicial branches. And that's a deformity of our constitutional system.
As you've described it, there is a trunk to these branches, and that trunk is the people whose authority the government is using and acting on. We are represented that way. How do we as a people adjust and change our expectations and communicate those expectations in a way that can help improve some of the things you've described?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I have three thoughts. The first is we need to do things like you all are doing today and your students watching this are doing, which is we need to familiarize ourselves with our constitutional framework, because it's a pretty darn glorious inheritance to believe that people are created in the image of God with natural rights that predate government, and government isn't the center of our community. It isn't the center of our identity. Government is a tool, and it's supposed to secure our freedoms. And so constitutional education and civics are pretty darn important. Second, I think we need more people to run for office, and in particular, to think of it as a service calling for a short time and then go back to the rest of their lives. We shouldn't have the professionalization of politics where a small set of people become politicians and they stay for their whole life. People should only go to Washington for a limited time and then they should go back home. George Washington obviously was a pretty great exemplar of this tradition. In 1796, at the end of Washington's second term, when he decided to step down, he gave this farewell address to the country. In Lin-Manuel Miranda's telling, Hamilton is his muse, and it's the song Teach Him How to Say Goodbye. And Washington wanted to go back to Mount Vernon, not just because he preferred to be in Mount Vernon, where he was from and running his farm, but also because he didn't think Washington, D.C. should be an example of a place you aspire to go to. This is the heights of community and meaning, and then you want to stay there forever. And so we need more people to expect that politicians would only serve for a little while and then go home, not try to be perpetual incumbents. And then third, I think we do need to have much better media consumption habits around how we think about politics. Politics is not like sports. It's not, as I say this as a son of a football coach and a lifelong wrestler. Sports are a lot more interesting than politics. And when people try to cover politics as a boxing match and as a horse race, it leads us to do and say and feel stupid things about tribe. I want Republicans and Democrats to differ about some policy issues and then set it aside and go have a beer together and break bread together. And, maybe some people are Packers fans and some people are Chiefs fans, but you wouldn't need to sort your community based on your political tribal loyalties. And right now we have too many folks who think if you're going to do politics, you got to do it as blood sport. And if you don't want to do it as blood sport, then you shouldn't be involved at all. What we need is a lot more regular people to show up and roll their eyes at the weirdos in politics. We need a lot more regular people to say, one cheer for politics, not three cheers. This isn't the center of life, but not zero cheers either. Maintaining a framework for ordered liberty and thanking our troops for all they do to put themselves in harm's way to defend our freedoms. Those are pretty important responsibilities, but it's like eating vegetables. It shouldn't be cotton candy, and it shouldn't be your evening recreation. You should put in a little bit of time to be knowledgeable about the issues. We should thank those who serve on our behalf, and then you should go build communities of love and persuasion that are a hell of a lot more interesting than politics.
Senator, as you go about your work, you've expressed several times your appreciation for the Constitution. As you face decisions on a routine basis, what are the principles and ideas that you turn to frequently as your touchstones in decision making?
Yeah, so Donald Rumsfeld, now dead, but formerly Secretary of Defense, but long before that, Princeton wrestler, and then a congressman from Illinois. He would say, before I'm ever going to vote for anything that gives the federal government new power, first I want to understand, is the federal government permitted to do this thing? Is this an authority that the Constitution has given to the federal government? If not, I can't be for it. Even if it is a permissible power, is it possible that the private sector can solve this problem? Because if the private sector can solve it instead of the public sector, then I'd rather not have the public sector crowd out the private sector. The private sector allows more failure and more diversity, and I mean failure in a good way. You want lots of restaurants in your community to not be decreed by the government. There will be one restaurant and it will be Italian and it will be open 5 days a week for these hours. You'd rather have an entrepreneurial market of a whole bunch of people figuring out who makes better food and is open the right hours and gives great customer service that's high quality at a low cost. And you'd like a diversity of options for the public. And so you prefer private to public sector, both for-profit entities and not-for-profit entities. Of stuff that happens in the public sector, is it possible that we can solve this problem at the state and local level? If so, again, we should prefer to do that because it allows more diversity. The founders used this phrase, they didn't say 50 laboratories of democracy, but they referred to the states as laboratories of democracy because the 13 then, the 50 now, we have very different communities, problems, strengths, weaknesses. Nebraska and Vermont have very different farming. Vermont has darn great gardens, but Nebraska feeds the world. And so the regulatory framework that you're going to use for a cattle operation in Nebraska, we're by far the largest cattle state in the union. The regulations you're going to use about how to manage rainwater runoff from a manure pile at a place that has 10,000 head of cattle so that the toxicity of the rainwater runoff from that manure pile doesn't poison somebody else's corn and bean row cropping operation down the hill. That's going to be different than the way you should regulate agriculture in Vermont. And so I want a diversity of options, public and private versus public sector, and state and local government versus federal. And then at the federal level, there should be a small number of things we do. The most important one should center around our common defense, national security, and intelligence issues. And we should make sure that there are opportunities for proof of concept and for trial projects and for renewal. We shouldn't authorize programs of the federal government to exist for eternity. We should do them for 1 year or for 3 years or for 5 or 6 years. And we should have those programs set to expire so that then we deliberate again, is this the right way to use the monopolistic powers and the taxing authorities and the prohibitions and the imprisonment powers of the federal government?
What is your aspiration for the country that you hope your service leaves for today's young people, for today's students?
Yeah, I think that we are all blessed to grow up in the greatest experiment in liberty and in government and governance in human history. Government is not the center of the world, but this is a pretty amazing experiment. And the fact that it's gone on 240 years would probably surprise our founders. When Benjamin Franklin was leaving the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in summer, fall of 1787, there's the apocryphal story of the little old lady who wandered up to him and said, "What kind of government did you give us?" Because many people still thought we'd end up with a monarchy. And he said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." And Ronald Reagan was enshrining that same principle when he regularly said, freedom is always one generation away from extinction in the American experiment. And he didn't mean that as a pessimistic comment. He meant your grandma and your grandpa can't preserve liberty for you. We don't believe in an autocratic, centrally planned state. We believe we, the people, are responsible to pass along freedom to the next generation. It doesn't happen in the bloodstream. It happens by our civics. And that requires us to celebrate and to feel gratitude for what we've inherited and what we get to experience. And one more, George Washington, that Abraham Lincoln explained so well and extrapolated upon. George Washington would say that our constitutional structure and our federal government are a silver frame, but the golden apple at the center of the frame is the things you use your freedom for. We want government to maintain freedom. You want government to make sure it's not dangerous to walk home from a restaurant late at night. We want a police force that maintains order in those streets so people are safe and secure as they walk home. But government isn't the thing you fall in love with. Government is a means to the end. And so the silver frame is the thing that makes it possible, the framework for ordered liberty. The golden apple is the things you build. It's your new mousetrap, it's your new app, it's your startup enterprise, it's the Rotary Club, it's the church or the synagogue where you invite people to worship with you, it's the people you try to persuade to marry you, it's the people you invite over for dinner. The great things in life are done by persuasion and love, and the American system enables that because of the silver frame, which is the constitutional structure that recognizes the inherent dignity of all 330 million people created in God's image. And I guess what I would aspire to is sitting here in 2022, that we would look forward to 2032 and we would be able to say more of our students and more of the next generation feel that gratitude, understand that inheritance, and are in love with the constitutional framework because of the liberty and the possibility that it creates in the community and the neighborhoods where you're raising your kids, because that's the center of meaning, not Washington, D.C.
Senator, we thank you for your time today and especially for your service to our country. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be with you all.